Okay guys, welcome back to the Counterintelligence Training Center. I'm actually very excited today. We've got 3 groups of trainees in here from all different parts of the country today. We've got some gentlemen from Idaho Falls, Idaho. We got some gentlemen from Salt Lake City, Utah. And we've even got a guy here all the way from Kodiak, Alaska. So counterintelligence is spreading all over the country. You're gonna see these guys walking around while we're doing this today. This is actually part of their training. Wanted to make a video today on our nice island piece of our new switchblade. We're switching our switchblade technique from our old version that we were doing with the Bondo blade. This one we're using a wider, more of like a 10-inch putty knife. But I want to get a video out on this, and I need to teach these guys anyway. We're going to talk about faces, how we deal with all that. So it's going to be a very thorough video. It's going to be a long video. If you want to stick around and get some good information, you definitely want to stick around and watch this entire video. You may notice we've already got some masking behind us on the cabinetry, and that is just because they've already started their process of learning. We've already cut off some backsplashes. We've already talked about prepping countertops ready to pour inside of a kitchen. So this is going to be a fairly long video, but it's going to be a very informative video, and you're going to love the way this one turns out. My right-hand man, Josh, is going to be helping me out here today. So first things first, we're going to be adding our color. So this switchblade technique is going to be very, very, very similar to our hand marble technique. We're going to apply the colors the same exact way that we do in a hand marble, but when we come time to spread the epoxy, we're going to be using a different technique, and I think you guys are really going to like it. So here we go. Always want to make sure you get some heavy spots of each color, but you also want some thin spots of each color pretty much everywhere. You want all these colors to be working together throughout the entire piece. This technique is very cool. Kevin, would you mind sliding that garbage can a little bit closer? I can throw this in. Thank you. Keep that one. Just stick it down on the floor because we'll need that reservoir. So the first color was our John Stone. The color that Josh was spreading out was our bone, and this is our liquid taupe. Okay, this is a very common color recipe that I use. You may see online on Facebook. We do a lot of single day training classes, little hands-on classes, to teach people about epoxy, allow them to get their hands in it and have a little bit of fun. This is one of the color recipes that we use, and everybody seems to like it quite a bit. So we just decided that we're going to use it on this today. I'm going to leave just a little bit of this color in this cup. Go ahead and try to combine that with the bone that's left in that bucket there. So just like usual, we're going to go from dark to light with our color application, with the exception of black. Black is always going to be the last color that we add. The reason why is we want to be strategic on where we put it. If you put black anywhere and everywhere, it's just going to turn this thing into a big mess. And you also, any big spots of black that you're going to add, you want to make sure that you're pouring it inside of your wet epoxy. Don't be pouring it straight to your primer. You're also going to see me drizzle some drips and drops of black everywhere. It's okay at those little tiny spots hit the primer that's dry, but if you pour out a big spot of black onto the primer, you're going to have an issue getting it to spread the way that you want it to. So we're going to pour a few spots of black inside of some of our wet areas of epoxy. Get a small one here and a small one here. Then I'm going to take my stick and I'm just going to drizzle this. I want a little bit of black everywhere. Black, with the exception of our white marble pieces, black is going to enhance just about every other recipe that you have, as long as you don't overdo it. If you overdo black, you will turn your epoxy project into a black project very, very quickly. Just going to drizzle a little bit of this everywhere. This is really going to richen up all these other colors everywhere else. Okay, let's put that on the cart. Okie doke. So first things first, it's really kind of important. It's difficult for two people to do this project at the exact same time, the exact same step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow Josh to spread the epoxy over this countertop. And as he's spreading this epoxy over this countertop, I'm immediately going to shift over and teach you how to start dealing with your faces. His goal is to cover this countertop with as few amount of strokes with this 10-inch blade as he possibly can. Then once he's got that done and we've got our faces coated nice and evenly with our epoxy, then we're going to manipulate the grain and kind of create the design that we want. Hit it with our isopropyl, and you guys are going to be astonished with how cool this looks. So Josh, you go ahead and get everything covered, and I'll come in behind you and make sure everything's going okay.
Like Troy's saying, we don't want to over manipulate this. The goal of this step for us now is to get our surface completely covered. So we're going to take some nice even pressure, and we're going to take this material and just move it with us. It's okay if we don't get it all in one shot, right? Because it's going to take a couple passes because of how big this piece is, right? So we're coming back and forth. I'm not super concerned right this second about how it looks. This is not the manipulation stage. We're trying to get our product evenly coated across our surface, right? So you can see I've got medium pressure. You can see I'm pushing almost a wake in front of me of this epoxy, but I need to make sure that I'm getting this covered. I've got a quasi-shallow angle going here. It's nothing super deep or tight, but I want to be able to move this material across my entire piece. I've also got to get enough on the edges for Troy to work with. Troy can't coat these faces if I don't leave him anything to coat it with, okay? So just notice how I'm just lightly putting pressure on this. I'm making sure I get a little bit to fall over as I'm driving it, okay? See, I just let that lay over, and you're noticing that there's some areas that are going to be thin. We're going to show you how to address that as we go forward here. So I'm going to lay this up. I'm going to pull it up on these edges here. And give it a once over as I'm moving forward to check and see, okay, where do I like it? Where do I not like it? Where does it look thin? Where does it look like I don't have enough coverage? So come over here and show them this, Chris, so they can see. You can see with this technique, since I'm pulling it right in here, you can see how it's thin right there, okay? We're not going to make a huge big deal out of that and freak out. We're just going to come back here. We're going to get into where we have our wake, a little pressure. We're going to bring that material right back over it, and now we've got coverage there, okay? We're going to come back through again a second time with this and manipulate the body of the epoxy, and we'll tighten it up and loosen, we'll loosen it up with the torch as well. So now that I've come through, gotten a nice coat across everything, it's not necessarily even, but that's not what the step we're looking for quite yet. We can move on to the next part of this piece.
It helps a lot if you forget to put your second glove on, folks. I always recommend making that mistake. It'll teach you how to work on the fly. It's okay. All right, so Josh has got everything spread out for us nice. Like he said, your goal is not to get it perfect. Your goal is to get epoxy over the entire surface of this countertop. Now, if Josh is doing this by himself, actually, let me have yours because it's already coated. You hang on to that in case we need to do anything else. When you've already got a bunch of epoxy coated on your blade, it just makes this part that much easier because it's not gonna take any more off of the countertop. It's just gonna move it around. So you need to kind of know what kind of flow you want to have to your piece. Like usual, we're gonna kind of flow in a light diagonal across this piece, but we want to be very feather light, slightly adjusting the amount of pressure on our blade and adjusting the width that our blade is coming across. Don't be scared to kind of overlap a couple of different swipes with that blade And in an area where maybe it was a little bit lighter, don't be scared to drop off a little bit more epoxy in those areas. This is something that is very hard to narrate and make you really kind of understand. This is a feel thing. This is something that you would just have to kind of practice getting the width of the blade to be thin and thick and varied. You just don't want to create too much of a repeated pattern. All right. So I can scrape off. If I get any thin spots around my edges, I'm going to scrape them off. I'm going to rotate this away. I'm going to kind of keep the same kind of a theme going, and I'm going to purposely kind of skip over a little bit of that area because I want some of these spots to look completely different than others, because anytime you look at a piece of marble, you've always got areas that kind of stand out and look different than the rest. So with this part of the technique, as long as you've got epoxy everywhere, you don't have to cover every single square inch of the countertop with this particular part of the technique. If it doesn't look right to you, then just kind of keep playing with it, but you don't want to overwork this product. We're very, very thin right there. So now I'm going to try to push a little bit more in that area, give myself an opportunity for that to be able to lay out. Worst case scenario, I got a really thin spot. I can come in here, get some of my drippings in my hand, come out here and drop them off in that area that's super thin. Okay. Now I can kind of go right back to my blade and figure out a way to work that in and make it look cool like it belongs. All right. So prior to moving forward, I got another super thin spot right over here. I'm just going to grab me a little bit of epoxy and drop it off. We're looking for any, I think we're super thin right here.
Yeah, we got a couple on here, Troy.
Okay.
I'm just going to add
get some drips and just fill that in. Anything that looks super duper thin to you, just fill them in. You might say, oh, Troy, you're touching it. You're going to ruin it. You're not. Okay? It's just all part of the marbleization of the stone. Once we hit this with isopropyl, you'll be amazed at how much that all just flows together. Now, let's say if you have a giant spot like this, like I'm purposely going to put just a bunch of fingerprints over here. That doesn't match anything else. So I'm just going to kind of reshape that a little bit with the blade, just so it kind of flows with everything else. Okay. So I'm not going to clean this blade off just yet because I may need to go back to it. One of the hardest things with this particular technique is learning how to be aggressive with the initial pass with the blade so you get the epoxy as even as you possibly can over top of the surface, but then be feather light with the touches when you're trying to shape it and create all the marbleization. So you might ask yourself, why are you doing this instead of just doing a hand marble? Because if you watch a lot of our hand marble videos, this isn't that dissimilar looking at this exact moment than our hand marble. But once we hit this with the isopropyl, you're going to see a drastic difference in how the hand marbles marbleize and how this marbleizes. Because when we use our hand and we're shoving this epoxy around, we're moving epoxy out of the way, and then other epoxy's coming in behind it to fill in the wake that we created with the pressure from our fingers, our hands, whatever that we're dragging through it. Whereas this product here with that blade, I'm real feather light dragging it around and kind of creating these waves and different shapes. And by doing that, it's laying one color of epoxy over top of another. So whenever I hit this with isopropyl, I get a very cool, very prominent webbing effect in my color. And it's very, very, very nice. So before I spray, I see a few more spots that I just want to address. Make sure I've got some epoxy in there. A little bit there, yep. Okay, I think that one's gonna be okay. We've got a thin spot here. thin spot here. Just trying to get some epoxy in those areas. This is where you love having your drips to pull from. Okay, it's looking like Josh did a pretty good job. We're gonna put a little bit more right here though. I got all this. Okay, so now, real quickly, anywhere that looks like too much like I just put my fingers in it, I'm just real lightly gonna re-hit that with my blade, just so it kind of looks more like the rest. It doesn't have to match perfectly. I just kind of want, I don't want anything to stand out too much. Like this spot right here that I touched, I don't really like that. So I'm just gonna always start on my edges and then work my way off. Okay.
So as Troy's doing this, I want to point something out that we get asked quite a bit. People in our class, people on our YouTube channel, how long can I have to mess with this? So this is a pretty good sized counter. We used about 80 ounces of epoxy. How long do you think this took us? To get to this stage, maybe 5, 7 minutes? We still have plenty of time to get after it. Like Troy and I say all the time in class, you haven't screwed up till you give up. All right, so if you need to come back here and get back on your piece, you need to get back in the field, you need to make an adjustment, whether it's add to where it's thin, you need to adjust it with your blade because it's not laying out and looking natural. You have time to do that. Don't rush yourself.
Don't panic. Don't ever hit that panic button. Hitting the panic button is what leads to really bad things. Okay, so now we're gonna hit this with our isopropyl, just like usual. We wanna barely hit this trigger. That's gonna give us some large drops and some small drops. Always test spray. Make sure that you're getting the spray that you want. Now you're gonna see a pretty dramatic effect on camera with this because you got so many colors laid on top of others. This is gonna be quite dramatic as the isopropyl hits this. And you're gonna see a very dramatic amount of webbing versus the hand marble of one color over another. Much more so than you get in the hand marble technique. As far as the pattern and the way these things look, as far as kind of the way they marbleize, this is very similar to a hand marble with the exception of you get far more webbing out of this than you do the hand marble. All right, cool. It's looking pretty good. It's starting to take shape. So now, at this point, we are going to turn most of our attention to giving one final look over the top. Obviously, we've got some indentations from the alcohol. We got to give it a few minutes to evaporate. But our attention now is going to turn to our faces. Okay, faces. One of the most common questions that I get asked, and whenever I'm doing a single day class, it's very difficult to concentrate and really get into how we deal with faces, because if you're doing sample boards, you don't have a countertop face to deal with. The faces of a countertop will make or break your job. That's the first thing that your customer is going to see when they walk into that kitchen. So the easiest way to tell a difference between a professional that poured an epoxy countertop and an amateur that poured an epoxy countertop is to walk in and look at the faces. Do you see drips, or do you see it look like actual stone going all the way through? Does this look like it was cut out of a piece of stone, or does it look like drips? That's really the big telltale sign on whether somebody really knew what they were doing and they were a pro, or they were just an amateur that bought some epoxy online. One of the most important tools that you can have with you whenever you're doing an actual countertop pour, not just a sample board, is a high quality soft bristle brush. You want to get that soft bristle brush saturated with some of these drippings or epoxy out of your bucket that you had left over pretty quickly, because you want that epoxy to be starting to cure kind of the same speed as it is on the countertop. If you can get away without having to touch it with the brush, awesome. But almost every single countertop is going to have a trouble spot. It's going to continuously cause you issues. The reason being is, as the epoxy is flowing over the edge of the countertop, anywhere that it meets resistance is going to be a trouble spot for you. You're going to start getting these like little teardrop waterfall spots because you got a point of resistance and then the epoxy starts to go around it. So you have to make sure if that starts happening that you keep it lubricated with epoxy. And the most important thing, the absolute most important thing, is you never touch the face with a dry brush. You always pre-lubricate your brush, saturate your brush with the epoxy, because if you touch a dry brush on the face, you're pulling epoxy off the face. Well, the face of the countertop is the thinnest part of epoxy that we have. So you can't afford to be removing epoxy from the countertop. In turn, anytime you have to make a swipe with epoxy on your brush on a face, you're always going to work from bottom to top. Because if you work from top to bottom, now you've removed the epoxy from the surface. Because you're relying on gravity to continuously pull this steady drag. That's what you want. You're trying to create just a seamless drag of epoxy down that face. And if you can accomplish that, you're going to get really pretty faces. But if you take this brush and you start up here at the top and you drag it down, you've removed epoxy. Whereas if in the same spot, I drag it up, now there's a slightly larger deposit at the top of that face that is now going to relax and come back down. It's going to help us create that smooth flow of epoxy that is really critical for us to get good looking faces. This is looking a little bit drippy here and a little bit drippy there, but it's going to continue to move. So my guess is that by the time this is done, it's all going to kind of look like this. It's going to be steady. It's not going to have this kind of waterfall effect. And so if you can just let it, be patient. Remember, we've talked about trusting the process, trust your product line. You know, you've got confidence in what this product line will and won't do. So just trust the fact that it's going to drip for about an hour. Our open time's 45 minutes to an hour, and then it's going to drip for another hour after that. Okay, so this is going to continue to move for a little while. So give it a little bit of time. If it's not looking perfect, as long as it's got epoxy on it, kind of let it do its thing for a little bit. Okay, because the least amount of times you can touch these faces, the better your results are going to be.